Okay, welcome back. We're on page 8 talking about the network types. The local area network, typically inside a building. A wide area network, typically between buildings. And then there's a thing called a backbone, which is like, what Sprint and AT&T and Verizon use to connect between Oklahoma City and Dallas. The internet backbone, so to speak. Okay. On page 9, they talk about the client-server model. You guys may not have been around, but I was. I'm an old fart. That back in the day when you had a mainframe computer over in the corner and everyone had dumb terminals. And so there was no processing whatsoever going on the machine at your desk. None at all. Everything was done at the other end. So that model kind of sort of still exists in the web. It's a little weird. So essentially you have a web server located somewhere, probably halfway across the world. And then you are the client, so client server. And quite frankly, it's not really your PC necessarily that's the client. It's really the browser inside the PC. So the browser is the client. The browser sends a request over to the web server. Web server says, oh, thank you for your request. I see you want to see this page. Hang on, let me fetch it for you. Grabs it and then sends it back. So it is a client server kind of a thing. Okay. I will admit that the whole idea of what is a client and where the processing is taking place is a little complex, because this machine just doesn't send you a pre-rendered page. It doesn't send you the complete graphics, everything. All it's sending you is like the parts. And so your browser has to receive the parts and say, oh, well, you want the text up here, then you want a graphic here, and you want there. It has to build it from all the parts. So it's sort of like when you send a request to the server sends you the ingredients, well, plus the recipe, and has the recipe and the ingredients, and then you make the web page at your end. Okay, cool. Let's continue. There's a bullet list on page 10 that kind of basically talks about how this thing works. So, if you are a client, then you're only connected to the internet when you need to be connected, right? Not all the time. And normally you're running a web browser, right? Like Internet Explorer or something. And yes, you're using HTTP as the recipe to be able to put things together. Yes, you request pages and those web pages are received. Okay. The server, on the other hand, is typically connected to the internet at all times. It's non-stop, 24/7, pointing to the internet. You run some sort of a server software. The two most popular ones are this one called Apache, it's a free one, and then the other one called Internet Information Server, which is part of the Microsoft suite. And yes, they use HTTP. Yes, they receive a request for a web page, they decipher it, and transmit not only the web page back, but some sort of a status code that says how we're doing. So that's essentially how that part works. There's a discussion here about how, remember I tell you about like a recipe and a set of ingredients. The web basically needs some way of talking about, well, this is a video file, and this is an audio file, and this is a graphic file. Because you know how there's a gazillion different file extensions for graphics. I mean, there's JPEG, and there's PNG, and there's BMP, and there's GIF, and there's a gazillion of them. I don't know them all. But there's probably 30 or 40 different file formats. And so we needed a way so that when you start transmitting this stuff back and forth, that the machine at the other end could say, oh, I know what that is. And so they created this thing called MIME. It's multi-purpose internet mail extensions. Yes, because originally we were talking about mail. We were talking about attachments, attaching a Word document or attaching a graphic. But, the web basically took off with it. So that's how you tell the browser. The browser says, oh, this content that I'm sending you, this is an HTML file. And this content over here, this is a graphic. And it's done with MIME. And we'll get into that a little bit later, but not anytime soon. On page 10, they talk about the internet protocols. So not web, but internet protocols. There's one called File Transfer Protocol. And that's where all you're doing is transferring files one place to another. For example, in my world, I develop my web pages locally on my machine, and when I'm done, I use FTP to send those up to my hosted server. and I'm using FTP, File Transfer Protocol. Email, obviously, and I'm not talking about web email because that would be a little confusing. So just plain old honest to God email, like you have an Outlook client on your machine. That's not necessarily using the web. So there's a thing called Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, SMTP, and then there's another one called POP and IMAP. Anyway, if you've ever set up an Outlook client, you know what these terms are. This is like the name of the server that does, the receiving your mail, and which one you use for sending. Anyway, those are protocols. So SMTP is a protocol, and POP is a protocol, and IMAP is a protocol. And then we have Hypertext Transfer Protocol, HTTP. And yes, this is the rules for how to ask for and get stuff from the internet. And I mentioned before, HTTP is not a very robust protocol. It's only got, about, 10 or so commands, like get, put, it's very simple stuff. It's not complex at all. If your vocabulary only had like 10 words in it, well, that's kind of what we're talking about. This is a very simple protocol, not complex at all. Okay. They go into some distinction here on TCP/IP. Most people have heard that phrase, and I'm not going to get into details. But basically, what you kind of sort of need to know is the Transmission Control Protocol, TCP, is responsible for making sure that information got there correct, that it didn't get lost or damaged on the way. It's sort of like the error checking kind of a thing. It also does speed control and a bunch of other things, but this is not a networking course. The IP part, so TCP/IP, the first half is about error checking and correcting. The second half is about routing. How do I get from Chicago to San Francisco? How many different, how do I get there? How does my packet of information traverse the United States to get to the other end? That's what that's about. So there's a term called a packet switched network. Basically what that means is information is broken up into small chunks and sent on the wire. And the idea is, let's say for example, let's say I was going to send you a 50 megabyte Word file, all in one chunk, okay? I send you the entire thing, and you kind of have a noisy line, right? And so it's 99% done, and then boop, you get an error. So you go, well, I'm sorry I didn't get it. Let me send it to you again. And this time it gets to 47%, and there's a little blip. And damn, okay, I need to send it to you again over and over and over. Wouldn't it kind of make sense to break it up into small chunks? And so you would come back and say, okay, I had a problem here at 47%. Could you send me just that one piece? Woohoo! So there's an awful lot of merit to taking big files and breaking them up into small packets and sending them on their way. That's what packet switched is all about. It certainly makes things more robust. Okay. Next thing to talk about is the IP addressing scheme. So IP, Internet Protocol, has two functions in life. One, it's the addressing scheme that we use, plus it does the routing part. I'm not going to tell you how, because that's a networking kind of a question. But in the old days, we had 32-bit addresses for IP, and it was, things like, 192.168.0.1, that dotted notation thing you've probably heard. Okay. Those numbers basically mean there's 32 bits of information there. And what happened is we were running out of room. And so they decided to make an addition to IP called IPv6 for like version 6, V6. So IPv6, I thought they were going to double it from 32 bits to 64 bits because that would have been plenty of addresses for the entire planet. But no, they went to 128-bit addresses, which means now every person on the entire planet can have a million different IP addresses, and we still wouldn't run out. Okay, so that's a monstrously huge number of addresses, unbelievably big. Okay, the domain naming system, DNS. This is sort of operates like a phone book. So most humans aren't very good at remembering numbers. If I said, well, go visit my address at 148.22.76.66, you'd be going, oh, wait, let me write that down. You know, because just humans aren't good at that. But if I said, go to www.kumquat.com, as long as you could spell kumquat, then you'd be okay and you can kind of sort of remember that. So humans are just better at remembering names than they are numbers. And so that's what this thing does. Just analogous to a phone book. If you don't call Aunt Sally very often, you can probably remember Aunt Sally's name, right? But you probably won't remember her phone number. So you look in the phone book, you look it up. Oh, there's her phone number, and you dial the number. That's what the DNS is. You type in www.google.com, and it says, hang on a second. It goes, looks it up in the phone book, returns the IP address, and then your browser does its thing. That's it. That's all it's all about. That's also the place that if you are going to build your own website for real, you would have to make sure that somewhere, that your domain name got put in the phone book, right? Because you have a brand new website out there, and you need to insert your name into the phone book. And I'm not going to explain how that works, but that's what DNS is all about. On page 13, they talk about the Universal Resource Locator, URL. There's actually two phrases. There's one called a Universal Resource Identifier, and then a locator. So it's a URI and a URL. And in practical terms, there's no difference. But this is one of those things where, you know, stump the chump kind of thing, like during an interview, right? You're interviewing for somebody, you're trying to impress them. You might want to say, well, you know, a URL is a subset of all URIs. But from practical point of view, it doesn't really matter. There is another thing called a URN. It's for naming. And unless you're a programmer, you've probably never even heard of it or ever even seen one. That's why I say for most people, there's no difference between a URI and a URL. Not so if you're a programmer, but if you're just a web guy or gal, then no problem. Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about is the parts of a URL. This is kind of sort of important. So here's what a typical URL would look like. So the first part is the protocol. Now this could be HTTP or HTTPS. It could be lots of others. There's even one called mail to, where you can do an email address. Kind of cool, huh? So this is that. I'm going to skip this one for just a minute. This is the www, and not all websites require you to have a www. That's completely optional. So I'll skip that for just a second. And this is part of the domain name. So Web Dev Foundations is part of the domain name. Net is part of the domain name. And then there's a folder. And then finally we end up with a web page. Okay, so that's the way URLs look. Now let's go back to this guy. In the old days, when you were putting together a web page, you would point to the server, the actual honest-to-God server name in your domain. The problem is, just like I mentioned before about humans not remembering numbers very well, well, trust me, some of the naming conventions that organizations have for web pages is pretty weird. Like Hood C2, NEC 2002. Like, what? And so they could put that honest to God real name in there, but wouldn't it make a lot more sense to just create an alias? An alias for the name that everyone knows, that everyone recommends. And so why don't we just use www? Now, www is not the actual name of a server. It's just an alias, so you don't have to remember some god-awful naming convention. Okay, once again, we're at the 15-minute mark, and we'll pause this and pick it up again in just a minute.